we're all still here. Our community is well intact. I've got plenty of things to talk about, as do you. It's going to be a great night. Glad we could get on here and have a nice conversation like we always like to do. I can see, I'm sure you all love this lovely painting that is in the back. I can assure you it is definitely real. It is definitely not going to turn off at any point during this broadcast. Just kidding. But yes, all is good, folks. I'm really glad to be able to engage with all of you. Welcome back. I had a little bit of a break. I didn't stream for a little bit. Since this pandemic, we've been going. We've been doing a lot of streams. I used to do just once a week, but now it's almost barely 2 days go by when I haven't streamed. Well, I took 4 days to just kind of detox from all the streaming and all the world and just kind of get back into the swing of things. So now I'm here with all of you, and I'm glad to be here, and you're glad that I'm here, and we're going to engage. So if you have not done so, now is the time to hit the like button. Now is the time to hit the subscribe button. Now is the time to hit the notifications bell. The notifications bell, so you get notifications. Many of you are probably here because of notifications. So be sure to hit the notifications bell so that you continue to get your notifications. So glad to be on here to engage with all of you. If you want to post this on Facebook, post this on Reddit, post this on, where else could you post this? You could post this on Twitter. You could post this anywhere. I am always glad to engage with all of you. So there you go. The way we do things is I generally give my opening remarks, and then from there, after having given my opening remarks, I then will do the roll call. I'll call you out as I see you, and then from there, at that point, the next thing we'll do is I'll answer your super chat questions. And I'll do that until we're done. And that's how we roll. So I will start with my opening remarks. That's how we'll do things. Folks, many of us have come to understand the world in terms of dialectical materialism. Now, when I say dialectical materialism, people find that to be a very intimidating phrase. It sounds very highfalutin and complex. It sounds like something very, very, very impossible to understand, but it's not. I've explained dialectical materialism many times, and I can explain it once again. Dialectical materialism is the belief that all that exists in the universe is matter, but that matter is constantly in a state of motion and change. That A does not equal A, because there is no way that that first A can be identical to the second A. A does not equal A, because all that exists in the universe is matter, but that matter is constantly in a state of change. And how does this change come about? It comes about through the clash of a thesis and an antithesis. And the two of them clash. And the result is something new called a synthesis. And that this is called the Hegelian dialectic. The thesis clashes with the antithesis, resulting in a synthesis. Then the synthesis becomes a new thesis, producing a new antithesis. And then they clash, producing yet another synthesis. And this is the process through which human history advances. That is Hegel. And it was Karl Marx who combined Hegel's understanding of the dialectic with the Greek materialists and their understanding that matter is the basis of reality, that thought is inseparable from matter that thinks. And then it was these two concepts, dialectics and materialism, that laid the basis for Marxist philosophy, dialectical materialism. Now, I've talked about this many times before, and I have a video, What is Dialectical Materialism? It's very popular. And if you study history, listen to the speeches of the Black Panthers. You can find video of Fred Hampton explaining dialectical materialism. You can find video of Huey Newton explaining dialectical materialism. You can even find video of all kinds of revolutionary leaders from around the world talking about dialectical and historical materialism. It's pretty key in understanding revolutionary movements around the world. But often when we discuss dialectics, that process of the thesis and the antithesis clashing to produce a synthesis, we think of dialectics in purely a conflict sense. We think of the working class fighting against the capitalist class to create socialism. We think of the feudal system clashing with the emerging mercantile classes to clash and create the modern capitalist world. We think of water and heat combining to make steam. We think of things clashing in a negative sense. But at risk of probably misusing a term that is widely used by other people, and I'm probably giving it a complete misrepresentation here. I'm probably not using this term accurately. But I want folks to keep in mind that there is a such thing, I would argue, as what you could call a positive dialectic. Now, I know that Adorno and some of the thinkers had a different concept of the positive dialectic, but this is my concept of the positive dialectic, right? When you think of the capitalist and the worker clashing, when you think of feudalism and the mercantile classes clashing, you think of this as a conflict. But sometimes you'll have two opposing entities, two opposites that will engage with each other in a very positive way and create a synthesis not based on confrontation, but rather a synthesis based on beauty and interaction. A great example: the student and the teacher. When you have a student, and that student really wants to learn, when you have a teacher, that teacher is very skilled and enjoys teaching, they can sometimes interact and make a very magical educational experience. Now, if the student is just not into it, they can have the best teacher in the world, doesn't work. If the student is really into it and wants to learn, but the teacher is just not skilled and doesn't know what they're doing, it doesn't work. But if you get that magical moment where you have a very skilled teacher who knows very well how to teach, and you have a very eager student who wants to learn, and the two of them can interact together, and you can get a back and forth that is just beautiful, a learning experience that is just beautiful, this can be a huge achievement. And this is what I would refer to as a positive dialectic. The student and the teacher are not fighting with each other. They're not confronting each other. They're not battling for power. Rather, the student wants the teacher to do well. The teacher wants the students to learn. And they pay attention to each other, and they bounce ideas off of each other, and they interact with each other. The student poses good questions. The teacher explains things very clearly, and the two of them go back and forth, and something beautiful, a synthesis is created, a synthesis not based on confrontation, but rather a synthesis based on mutual love is created. And it's very beautiful. And some of the most beautiful things in life, are created in this way. And that is what I strive to create. That's what I strive to create. I strive to create a positive dialectic. I seek to have a back and forth with you that is rewarding for you and rewarding for me. And sometimes I will plan out my opening remarks. I never plan the super chats. I have no idea what y'all are going to ask me. But sometimes I don't. Tonight I have kind of a loose outline of what I'm going to talk about. But sometimes I just get on here with a couple ideas. And the magic of what takes place on these lives, the magic of it, is our ability to bounce off each other. And folks, if it weren't for the pandemic, I would prefer to be doing classes in person, right? Because when you have other people there and it becomes a group experience and you can laugh with each other and people can ask questions and people can argue, maybe say, but what about this? It's a really rewarding experience. Learning can be a rewarding experience. The problem with our educational system, the biggest problem I would argue with our educational system in the United States is that it makes people hate learning. It makes people feel like learning is a painful, humiliating, degrading experience. And learning is one of the most beautiful things in life. To be able to learn something new, to be able to understand a facet of reality that you don't understand before, to be able to see the world in a new light, to acquire a new kind of information, a new kind of understanding, to be able to interact with people, to be able to understand a different way of seeing things. Maybe you don't adopt this viewpoint, but you understand it. That is one of the most beautiful things in life. And when we are striving to change the world, those of us who are activists, I am not. I am just a journalist, I'm a writer, not an activist. But those of us who are activists, what an activist does is not that different than what a teacher and a student do together. The activist goes out into the world and they seek to change it. They seek to change the world with their actions. And in order to do that, they have to have an impact on the world. And the world has to react to them, and then they have to react to the world. And that what goes on in an educational atmosphere is not that different than what goes on in the world. We've all had a very bad teacher before. And you think about a bad teacher. The students hate them. They become resentful of them. The students don't get good grades. The students don't pay attention. We've all had a good teacher, right? Or at least I hope we've had a good teacher. The students eagerly want the teacher's approval. The students are working hard to please the teacher. The students are listening to the teacher, engaging actively with the teacher. Think about governments. A failing government, a failed state, is a lot like a miserable classroom. A failed state, a government that can't get the electricity to turn on, that can't make sure the citizens have running water, that is presiding over the population getting stupider, the population becoming less educated, the population not having jobs, presiding over the infrastructure crumbling, waging wars that do not benefit the people of the country. A failing government is in a way like the worst possible teacher. But a successful government, a government of action, is in a way like that amazing teacher that you had. Because a government of action can mobilize the population, can listen to the population, understand what the population wants, provide leadership, learning while leading, leading while learning, from the masses to the masses, and can mobilize the population to carry out miracles, raise living standards, and carry out new achievements. So when we refer to the dialectic, when we refer to the relationship between forces, we are not always necessarily referring to it in a negative, confrontational, battle to the death kind of way. Sometimes there are opposites, sometimes there are forces that can interact, and they can create a beautiful synthesis. Sometimes you can have a thesis and an antithesis that create a synthesis full of beauty. And it is a synthesis desired by the thesis and desired by the antithesis. That's what I wanted to share with you. I wanted to open up that way because I feel like this is almost a universal experience. Anyone who's ever had a teacher, anyone who's ever been in school, everyone who's ever taught, anyone who's ever studied can kind of relate to what I'm talking about. And if that's the case, you can understand Marxism. I just explained something utilizing the science of dialectical and historical materialism. And no matter who you are, You could have never opened a Marxist book in your life. You can be a far right-wing conservative Republican. You can be a liberal who thinks Marxism is a bunch of Eurocentric trash. Whatever it is, that analogy that I just raised, I would argue is almost universal. And you can relate to it. And that shows that Marxism has a universal appeal. Marxism is not a niche interest. Marxism is not some, obscure hobby for a group of autistic white males who sit there and argue with each other about obscure points of theory and other people can't understand it. Marxism has an application in your life. You can understand Marxism. If you can understand what I just said about the teacher and the student and the positive dialectic between them, you can understand Marxism. So don't let anyone tell you that you can't understand Marxism, number one. Second of all, don't let anyone tell you that Marxism is this pointy-headed ideology, that Marxism is only for white males, that Marxism is Eurocentric. Don't let anyone ever tell you. Don't let anyone ever tell you these lies. Because Marxism is about reality. It is about the world all around us. It's about how change comes about in the world, how different forces interact with each other. And what we are doing here, the dialectic between us, is very, very Marxist. Now, I'm going to write down a couple of the super chats that just came through. I was very excited, so I didn't stop. And then I'm going to get on with the rest of what I have to say for tonight. Wow, okay. Okay, all right. Decolonization. Land back. Very good. Okay. And I'm writing down these super chats because I love answering your questions. Books on Syria Bothism. Very good. Now, folks, I wanted to talk to you tonight about a concept. Oh, there's another super chat. Thank you, Professor Maupin. Keep up the great work. Ha, ha, ha. Well, great. I'm sure you mean that in a positive way. Now, I want to talk tonight about a concept, really two concepts. I've been hammering home at you. Caleb, I wanted to thank you for helping me make the decision to quit marijuana. Very good, Fire Dog. I think that's a great decision. I think it's a personal choice if one uses marijuana or not. I don't think anyone should go to jail for it. I think it should be decriminalized. But you made the decision to not do that and to try and raise your intellectual level and try to not zone out and get high, but instead face the world and engage with how to change it. And I praise you for that, Fire Dog. But good for you. Now, I've been explaining to you all for a long time on these lives about divisions in the ruling class. That's been a recurring theme on these live streams, divisions in the ruling class. And I've been explaining to you all for a long time about divisions in the socialist movement and the synthetic left. And we are entering a period where in an odd way, a very, very odd way, these two things that I've been explaining to you are starting to come together. The divisions in the capitalist class and the divisions in the socialist movement are suddenly coming together in a way that is very, very interesting. Now, the way I explain the divisions in the ruling class is like this. I have argued that for many years, for at least the last 100 years, there has been a big division in the United States between the rich and the ultra-rich. Wrote it down. Popular left, vengeful. Go back to when the Federal Reserve was created. The Federal Reserve was created, the Federal Reserve Bank, was created because it used to be every 1 or 2 years on the stock market, there would be a panic They called it a panic, where the stock market would crash, people would lose all their money, there'd be mass unemployment. And capitalism is a very unstable system. And so J.P. Morgan, one of the richest men in the United States, I think he was the richest man at the time, he put up some of his money to stabilize the capitalist economy of the United States. And then he gathered some of his associates, other bankers and wealthy people, on Jekyll Island, and some of the ultra-rich in the United States created the Federal Reserve Bank, a private corporation chartered by the U.S. government for the purpose of stabilizing the economy. The ultra-rich realized that it was worth it to try and keep the U.S. economy stable, even if they had to put up some of their money, even if they took a short-term financial loss. They realized that in the long term, it was in their interest to stabilize the economy. Meanwhile, many low-level capitalists did not agree with that decision. They said, no, that's not the free market. Having this government bank that stabilizes the economy, even though it's a private company, having a state, facilitated corporation that stabilizes the economy, that's not capitalism. That's not the free market. Sink or swim, right? Sink or swim. The lower levels of capital have always resented the higher levels of capital. The Rockefeller family, that's Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller's creation. They have long been known to be advocates of Malthusianism. They seek to control the birth rate. They think there are too many people in the world, and that all the protests and strikes and revolutions that have been happening are all because the common people just have too many children, and we just need to reduce the human population. And the British Empire has long thought this. Malthusian thinking has been around for a long time. But this is the belief of the ultra-rich, of the finance capitalists, of the oil bankers. Meanwhile, the lower levels of capital think the opposite. The lower levels of capital have said, no, we want there to be more people, so they buy more products, and we can sell. We want the economy to expand more, so there's more for us. The ultra-rich have a managerial perspective, meaning that they seek to manage the economy. They want a stable society, so they stay at the top. The rest of the capitalists have an entrepreneurial perspective. They don't want any restrictions. They don't want the government involved. Why? Because they want to make lots of money. The ultra-rich don't mind having the state involved. Why? Because they know they're rich enough, they'll get the government contract. The lower-level capitalists resent that. They resent having the government involved because they know the government is going to favor the richer capitalists. And that this division in the capitalist class between the rich and the ultra-rich, it goes on up into our time. You talk about one of Donald Trump's biggest supporters. Who is it? Mike Lindell, the owner of My Pillow. He's only got $3 million. $3 million, $3 or $4 million. That's how much money the man has. The Rockefellers and the DuPonts and the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, they probably look at him, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and they say, get out of here. That guy's a bum. He's only got $4 million. Oh, boy, And if you read Mike Lindell's writings, Mike Lindell, the way he sees things, the problem is socialism. He wants deregulation. He wants the government off our backs. He wants free markets. He wants to drop the tax rate so that he can expand his operation. But if you read the way Bill Gates talks, if you read the way Jeff Bezos talks, they want more state involvement. They want more government control. They want more stabilization of the economy. They want to manage the rabble. They're not worried about making more money. They've got more money. They're worried about some kind of social explosion. Some kind of social explosion that could shake up the world and possibly knock them off their thrones. That's a division. That is a division. That is a division. There are different interests within the capitalist class. During the 1930s, when there was a Great Depression in this country, the lower level capitalists rallied around Henry Ford. Henry Ford, the owner of Ford Motor Company, along with the National Association of Manufacturers, they wanted a fascist state. They were tied with military manufacturing corporations. Labor unions were a big threat because if labor unions started collective bargaining, they were manufacturers and they would have to negotiate with them. And Roosevelt was almost deposed in a military coup backed by this faction, the National Association of Manufacturers and others, tried to depose Franklin Delano Roosevelt because they thought he was a socialist and they thought he was a progressive. Meanwhile, Roosevelt, who supported labor unions, was backed by the Rockefeller family. The Rockefellers sell oil on the international markets. The Rockefellers are finance capitalists. They run big, huge banks that lend money all over the world. And while the lower level capitalists wanted a fascist military state to prevent the threat of communist revolution, the Rockefellers, on the other hand, wanted a more stable solution, allow some workers to unionize, set up Social Security, make an alliance with the Soviet Union temporarily, and stabilize things. And that was the division in the capitalist class between the entrepreneurial capitalists who were tied in with the military, who wanted to crush the labor unions, and the Rockefellers that were tied in with international oil markets and finance, were close to the British. They wanted to stabilize things. That was the division. And it played out in the streets. Roosevelt backed the labor movement. He told workers they had the right to occupy their factories. And the Communist Party supported Roosevelt. And they went out in the streets. And the National Association of Manufacturers, they built the Ku Klux Klan and the Black Legion. And they backed and they paid for the broadcasts of Father Coughlin, the radio priest who admired Hitler. And they built fascist gangs that attacked the factories when workers were occupying them and tried to break strikes, the Silver Legion of America. And during the late 1930s, the communists who were aligned with Roosevelt and the labor movement and the Socialist Party and all kinds of progressive groups, and the fascists that were aligned with the National Association of Manufacturers and were against labor unions, they fought it out in the streets. And the communists, in their alliance with Roosevelt, they were victorious. And when the Second World War broke out, the United States was on the side of Britain and France and the Soviet Union. And the rest is history, as they say. There was a division in the ruling class between the rich and the ultra-rich. And this division in the ruling class played out during the 1960s, right? Immediately after the Second World War in the United States, we had McCarthyism. Huge crackdown on any communist activism, any belief in socialism, all kinds of brutal McCarthyite repression, right? The Communist Party leaders were all thrown in jail. They even had a law, the 1951 McCarran Internal Security Act, that actually went as far as saying that in a national emergency, there'd be 2 million subversives who'd be put in concentration camps. The Communist Party was forced to go underground. It was pretty awful. Hollywood was purged of all kinds of progressive actors and writers who were blacklisted. It was pretty awful. But then, what happened? The lower level capitalists started using McCarthyism to fight the higher level capitalists. Joe McCarthy accused the U.S. Army of being communists. The Rockefeller family were widely accused of being communists. The Methodist Church were accused of being communists. And the lower-level capitalists who resented the big capitalists got behind Joe McCarthy and started using the McCarthyism to attack the ultra-rich. The John Birch Society was formed. The John Birch Society's manifesto accuses the Rockefeller family of being communists. The John Birch Society is strongly against birth control. Well, the Rockefellers are big supporters of birth control because of their Malthusian beliefs. So McCarthyism turned into a vehicle where those lower-level capitalists could use the hysteria and the anti-communism to kind of push their agenda against the big-level capitalists. So you had the new left emerge, and the Kennedy family, and the civil rights movement. And there started to be a feeling among the higher-level capitalists that we needed to push back McCarthyism, control McCarthyism, restrain McCarthyism, and have stability in society, give some rights to African Americans so that that's not a ticking time bomb that could potentially lead to a revolution, right? Maybe have more of a soft power strategy in dealing with the communists instead of having big, huge wars, right? Big, huge wars make a lot of money for the people who make the tanks and the bombs and the guns and the military-industrial complex, those lower-level capitalists. But in the long term, it makes the communists more supported around the world in their denunciation of American imperialism. When the United States kills 4 million Koreans, kills millions of Vietnamese people, it makes all kinds of people around the third world curse American imperialism. And when they see the people of Korea and the people of Vietnam standing up and fighting, it makes people all over the world sympathize with the communists. So the soft power faction, the ultra-rich, battled against the military-industrial complex and the McCarthyists. There was a clash, a division in the ruling class. Well, in our time, this clash has returned. The lower-level capitalists, Trump, the fracking companies, Mike Lindell, Betsy DeVos. Betsy DeVos is a billionaire, sure. You know where her money came from? Came from Amway, from Tupperware parties. Her brother, Eric Prince, is from Blackwater, the military contracting corporation. The lower-level capitalists rallying around Trump. They want more free market approach. They want to sell lots of weapons around the world. Meanwhile, the higher-level capitalists, the Rockefellers, Bill Gates, the Silicon Valley fascists, they have a long-term managerial strategy. A long-term managerial strategy. They want to control the world, they want to reduce the human population, and they want to gradually eliminate those countries around the world that challenge hegemony of Wall Street. They don't want to have big, scary, dramatic wars. No, they want to do it gradually with frozen conflicts and subtle coups and using proxy forces, right? You read what the Trilateral Commission, who basically laid out the strategies utilized by the Carter administration. You read what they wrote, right? It was Jimmy Carter, the peace president, who started the war in Afghanistan, the war in Nicaragua, right? And probably one of the biggest differences between these two factions is their approach to the question of growth. The lower-level capitalists, they want to get rich. They want to get more money. Mike Lindell used to be a crack addict. You read Mike Lindell's autobiography. This guy was snorting cocaine. I'm going to get rich. I'm going to start a pillow company. I'm going to go, American dream. That's the lower level capitalists, the fracking companies. They want to see that oil price shoot up. Go. They used to call them the fracking cowboys. That's the lower level capitalists. But the higher level capitalists, they say, slow down. We've got enough. Everyone should just slow down. People need to learn to be happy with what they have, right? Mother Nature, there's too much consumption going on. There's too many people in the world. These lower level capitalists, basically, behind all their virtue signaling, and their gestures and their attempts to show concern, what's really going on with these lower level or these higher level capitalists, with the ultra rich, is that it's a game of King of the Mountain, right? You know the game King of the Mountain. We're trying to get to the top of the hill. They're already at the top of the hill. So they've announced, game over. We're at the top of the hill now. Game over. You know, the game ends now because we're at the top of the hill. See, we're at the top of the hill, so now the game has to end. And that's what they're doing. Rockefeller, DuPont, Carnegie, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Eric Schmidt. Those folks are already at the top of the hill. So they're announcing, game over, everyone. Game over. And that's what's going on there. Climate change is a reality. I do not, for one second, deny climate change. But the answer to climate change is obviously more science, more human progress, getting beyond fossil fuels. It's fusion energy, it's asteroid mining, it's new fuel sources, it's human creativity. Yes, climate change is a reality, but the answer is to get to a higher stage, to get to something more efficient and rational use of resources. It's not to end human progress. It's not to try and roll back the wheels of history. You can't do that. It's not how these things work. So the lower level capitalists, they want growth. They claim global warming's not real. It snowed yesterday, right? That's them. Higher level capitalists say, growth is bad. Growth is bad. Too many people in the world, they have a pessimistic worldview. They're trying to manage things, manage the world, and gradually roll back human civilization. That's the fight in the capitalist class. It happened in the 1930s, it happened in the 1960s, and it's happening again. Maybe many of you, I'm married, I don't know, many of you have probably had a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a partner at some point in your life. You'll notice in a relationship, often you will have a fight with your partner, and you'll resolve it, and things will be good, and then some time goes by, and you'll have a fight. And at first, it'll seem like a completely different fight. It'll seem like it has nothing to do, but pretty soon you'll realize that the old fight that you thought was resolved is kind of reliving itself in the new fight. I'm sure anyone who's been in a relationship has experienced that. They've experienced that. Now, it's not exactly the same fight, but the character traits of your spouse that you are frustrated with, and the character traits of yourself that they are frustrated with, are once again manifesting themselves in the argument. You've experienced this. It's not the same fight. Right? The fight in the 1930s, when the lower level capitalists wanted a fascist military state, to crush the communists, and Roosevelt supported labor unions and was for the working man, and that was one manifestation of the fight. The 1950s and 60s, where the lower level capitalists wanted free market libertarian policies, different than fascism, right? They wanted free market libertarian policies, and they wanted to crush the commies, while the liberal capitalists wanted more social democratic welfare state and wanted to negotiate with the Soviet Union. It was a little bit different. And now, the fight that we're having now, Trumpism versus whatever you want to call the mainstream of American politics, the centrists, the political establishment of the United States, the liberal order, it's a little bit different. But at the end of the day, it is the latest incarnation of this same fight. And the socialist movement, the movement of revolutionaries who want to bring down capitalism and create a new society, is having the exact same fight that it's been having for the last 100 years. The same kind of pattern is playing out in our movement, right? So what is socialism? What is Marxism? I always tell people to never assume that your audience knows what these things are. You have to be repetitive here. So I know a lot of you listening are going to know what I'm about to say. I'm still going to repeat it because it bears repeating. Socialism is the movement that strives for the banks, factories, and industries, the major centers of economic power, to be controlled by the people. It is a movement of the working class, of the majority of society, fighting to seize control of the major industries and the major centers of economic power and have them operate for the good of society overall, not the profits of a few. It's the idea that the economy should serve the people, public good. And that's what socialism has always been. It has been the idea that we can get beyond the rule of profits and greed as the motivating force for organizing society, and instead have a society where human reason dictates production, and production is carried out for the good of society. Capitalism is production for profit. Socialism is production for use. That's the difference, right? That's the difference between capitalism and socialism. And the socialist movement, fracking companies, the socialist movement has had many different incarnations. There have been many different fights. And probably one of the most well-known fights in the socialist movement broke out in the lead-up to World War I. World War I was happening, was breaking out. All across Europe, there were huge socialist parties, huge socialist organizations, labor unions were formed, socialists were in the government, huge socialist, educational institutions happened. Almost every major city had a socialist marching band and a socialist choir, a socialist summer camp for kids. Millions of people in Europe believed in Marxism and socialism. The German Social Democratic Party was the biggest such party because it was the party started basically by Marx and Engels. But there was the British Labour Party. There were all kinds of socialist groups in France. There were socialist groups in Austria and in Belgium and all over Europe. Here in the United States, we had the Socialist Party of America, Eugene Debs getting almost 1 million votes when he ran for president. These things existed. But in about 1900, 1898, 1900, 1901, 1902, 1903, there started to be a little bit of a problem because socialism and Marxism was everywhere. Everywhere people were believing in socialism and Marxism. You could not go across the United States or Europe and not run into socialists and Marxists and revolutionaries. But the revolution wasn't happening. There was no seizure of power. The workers were not rising up and seizing control of their banks and factories. It wasn't happening. So there was a problem in the socialist and revolutionary movement. There was some kind of problem. What was the problem? Well, the living standards were going up. Right? Marx had predicted that under capitalism, the living standards would just decrease and decrease and decrease until there was a revolution. Except that's not what was happening. Living standards were going up. And why was that? Capitalism was moving toward its stage of imperialism. The big bankers and corporations of the United States were dominating the world and making super profits. And as a result of that, they could afford to stratify the working class. They could afford to give a few crumbs to different working class groups at home. The so-called skilled workers who were white, they had privilege. They got paid better wages. And because of that, they became less and less revolutionary. And the labor unions that represented them became less and less revolutionary. And in response to this confusion, as people became less and less revolutionary, despite socialist ideas being everywhere, you had different interpretations of what this meant. The primary interpretation at the time was put forward by a man called Edward Bernstein, a revisionist. He actually called himself a revisionist. He coined the term revisionism. And he said, socialism and capitalism aren't that different from each other, and capitalism just kind of naturally turns into socialism. Look, in Austria, they've already got universal male suffrage. Every man can vote, whether he owns property or not. Well, there's more working class men than there are capitalist men, so it's just a matter of having those working class men vote for socialism, and eventually it'll happen. And look, the Communist Manifesto lists 10 planks. One of them is public education. We've already got public education, right? The German Kaiser set up public schools. So look, where capitalism in the Western world just kind of naturally turns into socialism. Furthermore, Edward Bernstein maintained that, the Western countries have fully capitalist, industrialization. And on top of that, they've got big socialist groups and unions. So these capitalist countries are more advanced than the countries across the developing world. They're more advanced. So when the French or the British or the Germans or the Italians or the Americans invade a country and colonize a country in the third world, that's good. They're bringing their more advanced capitalist system to the developing world. Thank you, Kinky. They're bringing their more advanced system. So Bernstein, on the one hand, he did not advocate the overthrow of capitalism. He thought it would just kind of, through a process of reforms, turn into socialism, on the one hand. And on the other hand, Bernstein was an advocate of imperialism. He thought imperialism was good, right? Spreading capitalism around the world, making these developing countries more advanced. Bernstein coined the slogan, "The movement is everything, the goal is nothing." Meaning that there's not going to be any revolution. Socialism and capitalism aren't not that different. They're just kind of, one thing kind of just naturally leads to the other. There's no event horizon. There's no seizure of power. It's just kind of a gradual process. That was Edward Bernstein. Rosa Luxemburg did not much care for Edward Bernstein. Lenin did not much care for Edward Bernstein. Eugene Debs did not much care for Edward Bernstein. But Rosa Luxemburg and Eugene Debs and Lenin engaged heavily with the question, why are we not seeing the revolution? The crisis was still a reality. The fact that Marxism was everywhere but not producing the revolution, that crisis was still a reality. So the question became, how did they answer it? Then Lenin developed his theory of imperialism and his understanding that the capitalists were going across the world, making super profits, exploiting people. And Lenin wrote a very important pamphlet or book called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, arguing that the revolutionary energy of the world would not be in the Western capitalist countries, that because of this labor aristocracy and this extraction of surplus value, the revolution would come in the developing world. It would be countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America that had been kept poor by imperialism that would have revolutions. That socialism would emerge from the countries around the developing world that were being held back. Socialism would emerge from the East, not from the West. That the stratification of the working class at home in the Western imperialist countries created by imperialism would result in weakening the class struggle there. Meanwhile, in the developing world, the whole nation would be struggling for freedom from imperialism. And so the working class and the advocates of socialism and Marxism would lead the struggle of entire nations to break free from capitalism. That was what Lenin developed. Now, what's particularly interesting, at the same time, or a little bit earlier, before Lenin, you had a very interesting French Marxist, syndicalist, I should say, not really a Marxist, he was critical of Marx, named George Sorel. George Sorel. And George Sorel was a syndicalist, a leader of workers' movements. He's also wrangling with the question of why a revolution is not happening in Europe. And unlike Lenin, who developed an economic critique, George Sorel, and thank you, Adam M., George Sorel developed a psychological critique. George Sorel, the syndicalist, he said that the problem was a spiritual question. So definitely not a Marxist. George Sorel looks at the French Socialist Party and socialist movement. He looks at the German Social Democratic Party, and he says, look, these organizations are stale. They believe in socialism, they rally the workers, but they don't have, told you it was a totally real painting, they don't have revolutionary energy. They're stale. There's no passion there. They're excited about day-to-day reforms. They're not passionate. They're not heroic. And George Sorel starts digging into in self-crisis. George Sorel starts digging into mysticism and ancient Greece and Rome, and his writings talk about Socrates, and they talk about mystical practices and the power of myth. And George Sorel starts saying, look, revolutions aren't made by all of society. Revolutions are made by groups of fanatics, groups of men who want to be heroic and want to give the whole of their lives, like warrior kings or warrior priests. He's looking for like some kind of mystical thing. That's George Sorel. Now, George Sorel obviously became the basis of a lot of reactionary ideas. At the time of his death in the 1920s, George Sorel admired both Lenin and Mussolini, right? He was a very confused, thinker, but he was catching on to something that Lenin also caught on to. Lenin, right, he comes up with his theory of imperialism being the highest stage of capitalism and revolutionary energy being in the East. He argues for the creation of a new type of revolutionary organization. He says that instead of trying to build a mass party, a party that anybody can join as long as you agree with these principles and pay your dues, you can join, Lenin says, oh no, what we need is a party of new type. A vanguard party, a group of people who give the whole of their lives to be the tribune of the people, to bring down the system. That's Lenin. And he writes a book, What Is to Be Done, all about how we need a new type of revolutionary organization. What's interesting is that while Lenin phrases everything he writes simply in terms of Marxism, and he comes up with this theory of agitation and propaganda, there is something particularly Eastern about what Lenin is preaching. Right? The other socialists in Europe who are embracing Bernstein and reformism, they look at Lenin's theory of the party of new type, and they say, Lenin, this is not a revolutionary Marxist organization that you're building. You're building a monastic order. This sounds like a bunch of Franciscan monks. This sounds like the Jesuits. They said, Lenin, you're not building a revolutionary party to overthrow capitalism. You're building a mystical secret society. You're building the Illuminati. You're building the Freemasons. You're building some kind of weird conspiratorial secret group. Well, why did Lenin build his party of the new type? In a lot of ways, Lenin's party of the new type drew from Russia's thousands of years of history. Throughout Russian history, people have organized secret societies and secret orders to try and fight for the causes they believe in. There was something called the Old Believers that existed when the Russian Orthodox Church, modernized and reformed a lot of its policies. A number of Russian Orthodox Christians formed the Old Believers. They were secret societies that and they practiced the old traditions. There was a group called the Decembrists that tried to overthrow Tsar Nicholas I in a conspiracy. And that there have been mystical secret societies among Russians for thousands of years, and the same for China, and that there is a kind of a history of like secret societies and monastical orders and religious fanatical groupings that people give the whole of their lives to carry out political change. This has deep roots in Russian history. While the Western countries are moving toward more liberal democracy and openness and having parties that Lenin argued were debating societies, and that these parties were turning into debating societies and parliamentary reformist groups. George Sorel is looking at them and saying, oh, we need to go back to the mystical ways of knights and castles in ancient Greece and Rome. And Lenin in the East is actually saying, well, no, we're going to develop a different kind of political model. And that, in a way, you could argue that Lenin's party of new type was a bit conservative, right? And a party of the old type, you could say whatever you want, liberal organization, right? Everything is completely transparent, one member, one vote. Everyone has a normal life and a normal job, and they They go and they participate in, they go to a party meeting once in a while and they pay their dues, and the newspapers are all privately owned. They're not owned by the party, and labor unions are not controlled by the party. It's a very loose kind of way of doing things, very liberal, very open. Meanwhile, Lenin is building this party of a new type that is a group of fanatics who give the whole of their lives. They don't even get married sometimes, and they go into hiding, and they have different names, and they have secret meetings and secret codes, and it's a completely different organization. And you can argue that the way Lenin was organizing was deeply conservative. Ecuador. Deeply conservative. Well, eventually, World War I broke out. And all the reformist socialists supported World War I. The German Social Democratic Party supported World War I. The French socialists supported World War I. The British socialists supported World War I. The Italian socialists supported World War I. World War I broke out. And all these reformist socialists who said that capitalism just kind of naturally turns into socialism, they all supported the war. But Eugene Debs here in the United States, Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, they didn't support the war. So, a lot of them went to prison. A lot of them got killed. Out in, I think, Seattle, there was a socialist leader who was lynched. A lynch mob came and hung him because he was handing out anti-war leaflets. Thousands of socialist leaders went to prison here in the United States for opposing World War I. It was big. World War I came, and that fight between the reformist socialists, who said that capitalism just kind of naturally turns into socialism, and the more revolutionary wing, it culminated, right? And the socialist movement was broken largely. And after World War I, you have the Russian Revolution, and the socialists around the world that support the Russian Revolution form communist parties. And the socialists in the Western countries who don't support the Russian Revolution and hold on to that gradual evolutionary view, they are the social democrats. In the United States, you had the Socialist Party and the Communist Party. Two parties. And at one point, the social democrats and the communists hated each other. Later, they started working together. During the Roosevelt years, they were aligned. During the late 1930s. But in the early 1930s, they hated each other. They hated each other. They even had the Communist Party had a poem. The Cloak Makers Union of New York City was run by the Socialist Party. Well, the Communist Party didn't like it. So they came up with this silly rhyme. The Cloak Makers Union is a no-good union. It's a company union by the bosses. Those right-wing cloak makers are just socialist fakers who play upon the workers' double crosses. The Hillquits, Dubinskys, and the Thomases are making the workers false promises. They preach socialism while they practice fascism to preserve capitalism for the bosses. Right? The Communist Party called the Socialist Party social fascists. They said they were preaching socialism but practicing fascism. The Social Democrats, they said our main enemy is on the left. They volunteered to help the government crack down and arrest leaders of the Communist Party. Right? They set up think tanks to help organize and prevent communist revolution. Read about the Rand Corporation. You ever heard of the Rand Corporation? It's an old-time CIA mainstream think tank. It was set up by the Socialist Party. Set up by the Socialist Party. Read about the history of the Rand Corporation. It's up there with the Council on Foreign Relations. It's one of the main think tanks. It was set up by the Socialist Party. Right? In Germany, before Hitler came to power, the Socialist Party was huge and had huge seats in government. And police officers who were members of the Socialist Party used to kill communists in the streets. When communists were protesting, they'd get shot down by police officers who were wearing Socialist Party pins on their uniforms. That division between Social Democrats and communists, between those who seek liberal organizations and those who build organizations of fanatics, that division goes way back. And you can talk about how in the 1960s in the United States, the CIA funded something called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. You can Google the Congress for Cultural Freedom. It was a CIA program to fund Social Democrats. Social Democrats were getting money from the CIA to print publications like Partisan Review, Dermo Nat, Encounter. Intellectuals like Susan Sontag, Adorno, they were being funded. Irving Howe, one of the main social democratic thinkers who was key in setting up the DSA, was very heavily involved with CIA think tanks, CIA money. And the idea was to create and fund a wing of socialism that would direct it away from the revolutionary movement. But this also played in to that fight in the capitalist class. See? In the capitalist class, there was a fight between the ultra-rich and the lower-level capitalists. The ultra-rich didn't like the military-industrial complex. They wanted to deal with the Soviet Union in a more strategic way. They didn't want to escalate the arms race. They wanted to maneuver with soft power. Revolutionary. Require. And so, the reformist socialist leaders, the social imperialists who hated the socialist countries, who were being covertly funded by the CIA, not only were they trying to turn people away from the Communist Party and from the revolutionary movements and against China and against the Soviet Union, but they were also fighting a fight within the capitalist class. Right? Susan Sontag wrote all kinds of writing against McCarthyism. And if you look who was paying for these institutions, it wasn't just directly CIA money, it was Rockefeller think tanks. The ultra-rich were using what we've come to call the synthetic left, were using them to fight against the lower levels of capital. The lower levels of capital were fanatical right-wing Christians who wanted to outlaw abortion and birth control. Well, the Rockefellers very much funded Planned Parenthood. The lower levels of capital were socially conservative, Roman Catholic, and religious, and wanted to outlaw homosexuality. Well, the Rockefellers paid for the Kinsey Report, which was one of the report on sexual human behavior that was widely circulated in the 1950s, arguing that homosexuality should be more widely tolerated. The lower level capitalists, they didn't want drug use to be out there. But we now know the CIA, through MK Ultra, was distributing drugs and promoting LSD and other drugs throughout the United States. And there was very much a culture war going on in the United States, with the synthetic left, backed by the ultra-rich on the one side, and the lower-level capitalists, the military-industrial complex, on the other side. And that happened. The culture war of the 1960s was not just a fight between hippies and squares. It was very much a fight between the ultra-rich and the lower level of the rich. The lower-level capitalists were conservative, were McCarthyist, were tied into the military-industrial complex and military manufacturing. The higher-level capitalists were into soft power. They were into social liberalism. And there were differences. And the synthetic left was kind of mobilized to be the foot soldiers of the higher level capitalists in their fight against the lower level capitalists. They wanted a more liberal society. They wanted to, loosen social restraints. They wanted to create more social liberalism. And in doing so, they would displace the power of the lower level capitalists, but they would also spread that social liberalism into the Eastern Bloc. And it is widely understood that the overthrow of socialism in Eastern Europe, very good. The overthrow of socialism in Eastern Europe had a lot to do with blue jeans and Beatles music and rock and roll and counterculture. That the counterculture and the liberal social revolution was very key in bringing down the Soviet Union. So that fight was going on. This fight has been going on for a long time. So speed forward to today. And if you look at what's going on, basically, after the fall of the Soviet Union, as the world Marxist-Leninist movement becomes weaker and weaker and weaker, the remnants of the Communist International are not very strong. The various communist parties are pretty weak. And, there's plenty of socialism in the world today. There's plenty of communist and socialist stuff happening today. But in terms of the political organizations in Western countries that were aligned with the Communist International, those organizations are quite weak. You go to any Western country, the communist parties are very, very weak and small. What has come to replace them is largely the synthetic left. And if you get on the internet these days, if you are a leftist, it is your duty to protect the ultra-rich from Donald Trump. It is your job to protect the ultra-rich from the insurgency of the lower-level capitalists. Your job is to help Bill Gates and to help Carnegie and to help DuPont and to help the Rockefellers beat back the insurgency of Mike Lindell and the fracking companies and Betsy DeVos. That's your job, right? There's part of it is a culture war too. Betsy DeVos and Mike Lindell tend to be religious and conservative and libertarian. And instead, your job is to be very, very socially liberal and very, very, in favor of mechanisms to stabilize society. Right? And that's basically what it means to be a leftist. If you get on the internet, the majority of people who think that they're socialists and communists are people who think that Donald Trump and his allies are Nazis, which they're not Nazis, they're racist, a lot of them, but, Nazis, come on now, they're not Nazis, they're bad, for sure, and they think that they're racist or whatever, and they want worker cooperatives. They think that worker cooperatives are great. And do you know who else thinks that worker cooperatives are great? The Rockefellers. They do. In fact, profit sharing, the notion that every employee gets a stock option, is not new at all. Rockefeller think tanks have been talking about that for years, right? For years they've been saying to workers, have a portion of their paycheck, come from the stock market activity of the company. That'll motivate people to work harder, right? So this movement of people who think that all Republicans are Nazis and it's their duty to go out and fight the Republicans to the death, and we must stop the Republicans no matter what, and that, no, all the socialist countries, they're not really socialist. They're evil, brutal regimes that killed millions of people. Real socialism is when part of your paycheck is a stock option, right? Real socialism is just an employee stock ownership program. What are they? They're foot soldiers. They're foot soldiers of the ultra-rich. Writing it down. So that's going on, right? So largely that synthetic left current, if you want to call it that, has basically been absorbed to be kind of the foot soldiers of the ultra-rich. And they kind of were that during the 1920s, and they kind of were that. They very much became more blatantly that during the Cold War. And now, the internet crowd that say anyone who supports China or anyone who supports Cuba or anyone who supports Vietnam is a Nazbol or a Strasserist or a tanky, and you're not a real socialist, you're actually a fascist. That crowd very much are just kind of the foot soldiers of the higher levels of capital. But there's another twist. This is where it gets interesting. How was it that Deng Xiaoping saved China from the disaster of the Cultural Revolution? Right? The 1960s, China had the Cultural Revolution. 1970s, China was poor, was unstable, and Zhou Enlai, who was a very close ally of Mao, died. And Zhou Enlai had been seen as somebody who protected the intellectuals. Zhou Enlai protected the scientists and the teachers who were always being persecuted during the Cultural Revolution. And when Zhou Enlai died, at the funeral of Zhou Enlai, there was a massive counter-revolutionary riot. The teachers and the students and the doctors and the scientists of China went out and burned cars and smashed windows, and they were furious. Counter-revolution was brewing in China. The intellectuals of China, who felt like they could make a contribution, had lived in fear during the Cultural Revolution. During the Cultural Revolution, the Gang of Four very much believed that you could somehow get to communism in poverty, right? And that the goal was to make China as pure communist as possible, and it didn't matter. It didn't matter, if they raised anyone out of poverty, as long as they were following their pure communist principles. And all kinds of people that had skills, all kinds of people that were intelligent, all kinds of people that were creative were suppressed by the Gang of Four and by the communist government, because there was this feeling that, no, we must make everything egalitarian, we must exercise control. They had the 8 model works. You can believe this. During the Cultural Revolution, they had the 8 model works, they were called. And if you made a play in China, a play or a ballet or a novel, it had to follow 8. There were only 8 plots you were allowed to have. And if you didn't have one of those plots, you couldn't write your book. You couldn't make your play. You couldn't produce your movie. There were only 8 plots allowed, the 8 model works. It's nuts. Ridiculous totalitarianism. In the name of staying pure to communism, all kinds of suppression of human creativity was going on. And what happens when you suppress human creativity? What happens? Society doesn't advance. And China's economy was not advancing. China's economy was not advancing. They were staying poor. And the Gang of Four and the ultra-leftist clique that ran China said, oh, that's okay. We as long as we're pure communist, it doesn't matter. We can get to pure communism. We can get to pure communism, in poverty. But a lot of people in China, students, intellectuals, writers, scientists, mathematicians, college professors, people thought, hey, we can do better as a country, but they were being suppressed. Well, when Deng Xiaoping came to power, he said, poverty is not socialism, but to be rich is glorious. And instead of suppressing the intellectuals, instead of suppressing the scientists, instead of suppressing the creative people and the entrepreneurial people, he harnessed their energy to build socialism. He figured out how to utilize the entrepreneurial, creative drive. Let these people start their own businesses. Let them start their own companies, but control them. Control them. Make sure that what they do is in the interest of the state central plan. Make sure that their company functions according to what the Chinese Communist Party tells them to do. And when China changed its relationship with the intellectuals, with the middle class, when it created a capitalist class that was aligned with the proletarian state, the explosion of growth was massive. And now other socialist countries are doing what China has done. Nicaragua is a great example. Nicaragua is a socialist country in Central America, run by the Sandinistas. And in Nicaragua, the state runs the banks and the state runs the natural resources, but they have a micro-entrepreneur program where they empower people to start their own businesses. And it's been very successful. And it's been one of the most successful things the socialist government has done is help people start their own businesses, but they depend on a subsidy to run their business. And so they have to basically function in line with what the revolutionaries like. And that is what ultimately has made socialism in Nicaragua very successful. Vietnam has done the same thing. They call it a socialist-oriented market economy. The government controls the major industries. They have 5-year economic plans. But part of what makes the Vietnamese economy boom, and it has been described as an economic boom, is that while you have the state central plan, the state unleashes the creativity of the middle class. Right? And the same is happening in Cuba. Cuba is moving in this direction. North Korea would like to move in this direction. That socialism has adjusted to, instead of antagonizing the intellectuals, instead of antagonizing the college professors and the teachers and the scientists, instead of making those people feel like they're the enemy and controlling them, instead it utilizes their talents and utilizes their skills to raise up all of society. It unleashes them. And it has been through cultivating a capitalist class that is submissive to the communists, right? They don't run the country. They live in fear of the country, right? In China, billionaires have even gotten the death penalty. But it has been through creating a capitalist class that is submissive to the Communist Party, forced to obey the Communist Party, but allowed to be creative, but allowed to go out and innovate and create. That is what has made socialism so successful in our time. It's fascinating. Socialism learned from the Cold War. In the Cold War, the people who brought down the Soviet Union and brought down governments across the Eastern Bloc, the people that Zbigniew Brzezinski learned how to manipulate, those folks, the students, the writers, the innovators, well, now those folks are aligned with the communist governments. Now those folks are sympathetic to the communist governments. Right? That layer of intellectuals that the CIA learned to manipulate and stage color revolutions, now those folks are more loyal than ever to the socialist and revolutionary governments around the world. And then you'll start to notice some weird things happening in the United States. For years, it has driven me absolutely crazy. I cannot stand libertarians, folks. For years, libertarians have driven me absolutely crazy. Ugh! It's not real capitalism. It's not real capitalism. Oh my God, libertarians drive me crazy. They always have driven me crazy, right? I mean, ideologically, these people, they drive me crazy. One of my biggest pet peeves with libertarians, is that they'll say, socialism's failed everywhere it's ever been tried. And you'll say, China. And they'll say, oh, China's capitalist. And I'll look at them and I'll say, okay, all right. You think Obamacare is communism? But China, where the government runs the banks, and the government runs the industries, and the government plans out the economy with a 5-year plan, and Marxism-Leninism is the ruling ideology, that's capitalism. You really think that? Let's get this straight. So you believe that Obamacare is communism, that the United States is a socialist country because we have food stamps, but China, where the government controls even the private corporations and plans out the economy, that's capitalism. You really believe that? And it drives me crazy. And most libertarians will just they don't really have an answer to that. But one time, I did get an answer from a libertarian, an intelligent answer from a libertarian in response to this. And this is what they said, and this is very important. They're not correct. China is a socialist country. But they pointed to something that is very key to understanding the contradiction of our time. They said, sure. And they were talking about Russia and China as well. They said, sure, China and Russia have a huge amount of state involvement in their economies, right? Russia's economy is centered around oil and natural gas, huge amounts of government involvement. China has huge state-run industries and 5-year plans, like you pointed out. But both Russia and China have a very big middle class. They have a very big layer of small business owners. And that middle class, those small business owners of Russia and China, are ascendant. They are getting bigger. Whereas in the United States, our small business owners are getting crushed. And that's true. That's true. I've been to Russia and I've seen it. All right? The Russian state subsidizes low-level capitalists to start their own farms, subsidizes low-level capitalists to start tech companies. I've seen it in other socialist countries, Ecuador, when Correa was running it. That the socialist countries of the world have done more to help and develop that lower-level capitalist that in the United States is libertarian. I got a friend who works at an airport. He was an airport bartender. This friend of mine tells me that many times before the pandemic, he would encounter Southern right-wing Republican small business owner coming back on the plane from China. Many times he would encounter, right-wing, conservative, Southern Republican guy who owns some kind of company coming back from China and talking about how amazing China is. And China is where the growth is. China really understands capital. Now, what's this about? That lower level of capital in the United States, as delusional and crazy as they are, they still believe in growth. See? Meanwhile, the socialist countries of the world that are trying to raise their people up from poverty, they also still believe in growth. However, the higher level capitalists of the United States do not believe in growth and are trying to suppress the lower level capitalists here at home. And the higher level capitalists of the United States are also the imperialists that are trying to suppress China and Russia and Cuba and Vietnam and Venezuela and Nicaragua. So in this crazy, bizarre way, the lower level capitalists and the socialist countries are kind of on the same side of the contradiction, while the synthetic left in the West and the higher level capitalists are on the other side. Are things starting to make a little sense now? Is this starting to make a little sense? Is this starting to blow your mind? It's a very bizarre reality, right? It almost doesn't make sense. But the libertarians and the Communist Party of China and the Communist Party of Vietnam and the Communist Party of Cuba ultimately have the same enemy, which is the ultra-rich of the United States and the ultra-rich of Britain and the ultra-rich of France and Germany that are trying to stop growth. And they have the same thing. They want economic growth. And the ultra-rich don't want economic growth. Are you starting to get what's going on here? There has been this weird realignment. The fight between socialism and capitalism. I'm describing your uncle, Red Illuminati. The fight between socialism and capitalism. The fight between socialists that are reformist and pro-imperialist and socialists that are anti-imperialist and revolutionary. The fight between the ultra-rich and the rest of the rich. The fight between the higher levels of capital and the lower level capital has all kind of combined into the contradiction that we're living in our times. Why did they accuse Donald Trump of being sympathetic to Putin, even though Donald Trump escalated the arms race against Russia? Why? Why did they accuse Donald Trump of being sympathetic and friendly to Kim Jong-un? Why did Donald Trump give Kim Jong-un a flash drive with a plan for North Korea to be developed economically and all kinds of, economic development in North Korea? Why? Why did Jim Rogers, the legendary investor of Singapore, this cowboy cat-wearing capitalist, why was he a huge Trump supporter, and why was he a huge supporter of making a deal with North Korea and trying to negotiate between the United States and North Korea? Folks, it's getting weird, but these lower-level capitalists believe in growth, and the socialist countries believe in growth. Meanwhile, the ultra-rich want to destroy all the socialist countries around the world, and the ultra-rich want to beat down and control and destroy the lower-level capitalists. So there is a weird alliance of interests right now between the lower-level capitalists, and the anti-imperialist socialist states. Meanwhile, there is an alliance of interest between the synthetic left and the ultra-rich. The synthetic left just wants to beat down the lower-level capitalists. They think they're all Nazis. So, of course they're aligned with the higher levels of capital, right? They think socialism is just an employee stock ownership program. They don't want the workers to seize the means of production. They definitely don't support the existing socialist states. They're just a goon squad to control the lower levels of capital for Rockefeller. Meanwhile, they hate the existing socialist countries. So this is how weird it is. Well, folks, obviously, this contradiction is going to keep developing. The fight's not going to go away. Folks, I'm telling you my prediction. This is only a prediction. I am not advocating anything here. I'm just telling you what will probably start to happen. Right now, the lower levels of capital are disgusting. All right? They are libertarian, they're racist, they're awful. But I'm predicting that over the course of the next 10 years, maybe even the course of the next 20 years, the lower levels of capital in the United States are going to become more and more desperate. They think that they're feeling it now, right? After January 6th and after Trump getting voted out. Oh, they're in for it. The lower levels of capital, the Mike Lindells of the world, the fracking companies of this world, the Betsy DeVosses of this world, they are getting their asses kicked. The Biden ultra-rich faction that's in with Silicon Valley, they're banning them from social media, and they are kicking their ass. And they deserve it. These people are vicious to their workers. They treat their workers awful. They fight against minimum wage legislation. They deserve it. I am not sympathizing with them. But the Mike Lindells of the world, the Betsy DeVosses of this world, the ultra-rich, they are getting their asses kicked right now by the managerial bourgeoisie. They're getting their asses kicked. The folks who used to make up the John Birch Society, the folks who used to make up the Libertarian Party, the folks the Koch brothers used to hang around with, those folks are getting their asses kicked. They are getting pounded into the ground. And social media is banning them. Silicon Valley is against them. They are just getting pounded into the ground. And they're getting more and more desperate. Their companies are going out of business. This pandemic has just done them in, folks, right? Walmart did great during the pandemic. Amazon's doing great from the pandemic. But these folks, the pandemic just about killed them, right? If it doesn't destroy, how many of these companies are going out of business left and right? My prediction is that as these people get pounded harder and harder and harder by the higher levels of capital, they're going to ultimately be forced to break with their libertarian viewpoint. Instead of saying we want the government's hands off, they're going to start saying what they used to say, which is we want the government to fight for us against the ultra-rich. And as the ultra-rich come to dominate the economy, as Amazon and Uber and big companies become the major employers, and the labor struggles begin to focus on not fighting small business owners, but fighting big business owners, I feel like these lower levels of capital are going to realize that it is in their interest ultimately to make a strategic alliance with the working class at home against the ultra-rich and with the socialist countries around the world. And that just like in China, when Mao came to power, he led a bloc of four classes. A bloc of four classes, right? The main enemy was the imperialists and the Japanese invaders. There's a bloc of four classes. My prediction is that it will be the folks that are the lower levels of capital They will be forced by material conditions. They will be backed up against the wall and be forced to realize the only chance they have for survival is to enter a strategic alliance with the working class, with the labor movement, and the proletariat in their struggle against the ultra-rich, and with the people around the world and the socialist countries of the world in their struggle against the ultra-rich. And that ultimately, the lower levels of capital will do a complete flip. They'll do a 180. Instead of being the most reactionary element of American capital, that's the most libertarian, the most viciously anti-communist, they'll become so desperate that they will become the most progressive. They'll become allies of the countries around the world that are building socialism because they want to do business with them. They'll become allies of the workers that are unionizing and struggling for their rights at places like Amazon and Uber. And the lower levels of capital will enter an anti-imperialist alliance. They'll be forced to enter an anti-imperialist alliance with the working class and with the anti-imperialist countries of the world. It's not going to happen overnight. Might take a decade, might take 2 decades. We don't know how long the process will take. But eventually those lower level capitalists who resent the ultra-rich are going to be forced to recognize that the imperialists, the enemies of Russia and China, the enemies of Cuba and Vietnam are also their enemies. And that the working class at home, struggling for economic justice, struggling not to change the names of road signs, not to tear down monuments, but struggling for jobs and healthcare and education and wages and paved roads in their neighborhoods and economic development. They are going to have to enter a strategic alliance with the working class. And as that process takes place, that will be the beginning of America's march towards socialism. Mark my words. The process that happened in Venezuela. Right? It was a division in the capitalist class. Are you for neoliberalism and the Western imperialists, or are you against it? Right? Chavez was aligned with the capitalists of Venezuela that were against the ruling class, that were against the American ruling class. They entered an alliance with the working class, and that's how it happened. You can go through many countries that an anti-imperialist united front will emerge within the Western countries. The contradictions among the capitalist class, the contradictions in the socialist movement are going to play themselves out in a very, very strange way. And ultimately, in order to keep from being destroyed, the lower level capitalists of the United States are going to have to enter an alliance with the working class and with the anti-imperialist countries. And that will create the opening for socialism in the United States to begin to march forward. No longer in alliance with the ultra-rich, no longer in alliance with the higher levels of capital in their attempt to control the lower levels of capital, but instead marching to build a socialist society, a society where the banks, factories, and industries and the centers of economic power are controlled by the people. And there will probably be small business owners in socialism, but they won't be able to operate simply on the basis of what's in the interests of their profits. They'll be controlled by society, be controlled by the state. We'll have a socialist society here in the United States that builds corporations, right? Like, look at Huawei Technology. It's a state-controlled cooperative with profit sharing under Chinese law, right? What is this? Eliminate poverty without capitalism. Finite growth. So there you go. That is my weird, complicated view of how the United States will eventually move towards socialism. Based on what has happened in the world over the last 100 years, based on the fight in the socialist movement, as well as the fight the fight in the capitalist class based on how Russia and China and Venezuela and Vietnam have aligned themselves, based on what's happening here in the United States and how some of the lower level capitalists seem more anti-imperialist. That is my analysis of where things are going. That's where I'm at. It's not going to happen for a long time. It certainly is not happening now, and I'm not advocating this right now. That's my prediction. That is my analysis. So agree or disagree, you're welcome to do that. We shall see what happens. And I predict it'll take a long time. I predict it'll take a long time to play out. But I think this may be the ultimate conclusion of things here in the United States. So that is my conjecture. And thank you for coming with me on that very long journey. I've been wanting to put this all into words for quite a long time. So there you go, folks. We're 94 minutes in, and now we're going to have our roll call. Names and locations, I will call you out as I see you. Names and locations, and then I'll start answering these super chats, and then I'll go home. If my throat doesn't kill me first, because my throat is hurting because I've been talking a lot. That's okay. Names and locations, names and locations. Let me make sure I see all of you. Live chat, there we go. Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Australia, St. Louis, Missouri, Queens, New York City, Gateshead, England, Albany, New York, Phoenix, West Palm Beach, Torrance, Cincinnati, Ohio, Huawei, Mississippi, Cleveland, Pirate Alex, Juan from Mexico, Toronto, West Palm Beach, Puerto Rico, Interesting Thesis, West Palm Beach, Salt Lake City, Potsdam, New York, Washington State, Sina Beltway Branch, Max the Sax, Bathtub, West Palm Beach, Clydebank, Oregon, Julian from Texas, Nassau County, New York, Char Darling, Glasgow, Scotland, Mexico, Brazil, London, UK, Terre Haute, Indiana, Detroit, Michigan, Hungary, Sao Paulo, Brazil, Cheltenham, UK, Anchortown, Anchorage, Alaska, Michigan, Mexico, Finland, Sacramento Rivers, Joey from McKees Rocks, Rust Belt, Patty in West Hollywood, St. Louis, Pomona, California, Kendall in San Diego, Lockport, New York, Miami, Florida, Los Angeles, there you go, Missouri, Brazil, Stockton, Auckland, New Zealand, Idaho, West Virginia, Benton Harbor, Michigan, Space Coast, Florida, David in China, Cali, Soledad, Cali, Detroit, Michigan. Hey, Caleb. Hey, back to you, JM42. Who else is with us? Calvin from Saskatoon, Sweden. Sweden is with us. Very, very good. Colorado, Maine, USA. Very good. Very, very good. Who else is with us? Corona, California. East Germany. Leipzig, East Germany. Very good. Mo in Toronto, Canada. Iceland. Iceland. Very good. Kieran from San Diego. Alberta. Oh, thank you for the super chat, Olympia. Terre Haute. Here it's pronounced closer to Terre Haute. Terre Haute. Terre Haute. Or, I don't know. Never been there. Midwest, says Ali Nasser. Well, very, very good. Very good. I'm from the Midwest also. I grew up in Ohio. All righty. All righty. Well, folks, I'm glad you're all here with me. I'm glad we're back on here doing these lives. And I am going to quickly go through these super chats. And if you want to keep the super chats rolling in, I will answer them. My throat is fading. I've been talking for quite some time, and that's okay. And it's springtime, so I've got those spring allergies, but that's okay. If you gave me a super chat, I will give you an answer. But you know, I may not give long answers tonight because my throat is killing me. China's recent jailing of activists. All right. Okay. Of activists. All right. Very good. Okay. Decolonization, land back. Look, I have always said that I am for the right of self-determination for colonized people within the U.S. borders if they want it, okay? If African Americans would like to have an autonomous territory, and if the black community wants that, I would be in favor of a black belt South autonomy if the black community wanted that. If the indigenous people wanted to declare an autonomous region and have a region just for themselves, I would support that if they wanted it. If the Chicano people, right, the people of Southern California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, the Chicano people wanted to form the Aztlan or the Sun Belt and separate and have autonomy, I would be for that. I am for the self-determination of colonized people. The black people of the United States are a colonized people, and the Chicano people of the United States are a colonized people. The indigenous people of the United States are a colonized people. However, as I've said many times, I don't go around advocating this because they also have the right not to separate, right? Black people in the United States have the right to not separate. They have the right to integrate. They have the right to go to the same schools as white people. They have the right to live wherever they want to live. And the civil rights struggle has been very big. And that if a white person goes around advocating separation of other races, they sound like a racist, right? That sounds like the Ku Klux Klan. That sounds like, white separatists and white supremacists. If I go around saying to black people, yeah, I want all the black people need to move to this area of the South and you'll be separate, that sounds like the KKK. That sounds racist. And black people have fought very hard for the right to go to the same schools as white people, the right to go to live in whatever neighborhood they want. So you have to be careful with that. And this decolonization rhetoric, it's a little bit tricky, right? It sounds all radical when you and all your white friends are sitting there. You're sitting there with you and your white friends and you're like, I want to tear the United States apart, land back. Okay, that sounds all radical when you're with your friends. But I dare you as a white person to walk into a black neighborhood and say, I want you all to have your own country and be separate in the black. Look at this map. Here's the black part of America. I want you to go there. You sound like a racist piece of garbage, right? So you have to be careful with all of this. I believe that every colonized people have the right to choose integration or separation for themselves. If the Chicano people want to separate, they have the right to do it. If they don't want to separate, they don't have to do that. If the indigenous people want to separate, they have the right to separate. But if they don't want to separate, they want to remain part of the United States, they have the right to do that. If the black people want to separate, they have the right to separate. If they don't want to separate, and that is what decolonization is. It means no more are people, colonized nations held in bondage. They have the right to autonomy in terms of territory. That's what it means. Okay, and this has been the position of the Communist Party going back to the 1920s. This was their position. But you have to be clear about this, right? Some people look at that and they say the Communist Party was advocating separation and segregation. No, they weren't. They said that if the people of the Black Belt region wanted to separate, they had the right to it. And that's all there is to this. This decolonization thing. These folks, it's like, I feel like everything I just said is like something they're missing. It's like this LARP. They want to get on the internet and they'd be like, you're a settler. This land was stolen from native people. And it's like, and so what do we do about it? Well, we have an answer. The communist movement has long had an answer about how to address that issue, which is the granting of self-determination to people, the decision that they can choose integration or separation. Obviously, some form of reparation would have to be paid to populations that have been oppressed, obviously. But the communist movement has long had an answer to this, right? It's ultimately not up to us, right? If the black people want to separate from the United States, they have that right. And I could repeat myself. But that's the issue. That's what decolonization is. That's what land back is. That's what it is, okay? And if it means something different to you, if it means that we should forcibly deport all white people from the continental United States, that's not, I don't know any indigenous group that calls for that. I don't know any group of black people that call for that. So that's, the right to statehood in a territory is very different than ethnically cleansing white people from the United States. And I'm not for that, okay? And no communist is for that. No communist is for ethnically cleansing all the white people from the United States. That sounds like something the alt-right or white supremacists would make up and say that communists believe. And if you think that, I pity you, because that is absolutely not what any communist has ever advocated, right? Self-determination, yes. Decolonization, yes. Autonomy, yes. Supporting people's right to their own territory, yes. But if you just want to sit there and LARP and I hate America, okay, I get it. Do your emotional thing. You're free to do that. I won't stop you. But that's not, you're not doing a Marxist thing. So there you go. Alrighty. Books on Syria and Baathism. The best book I ever read on Syria and Baathism was by Stephen Gowans. Stephen Gowans, the Canadian professor, wrote a very good book on the history of Syria and the history of Baathist Arab socialism in Syria. It's very, very good. I don't remember the title of it, but it's Stephen Gowans is the author. Stephen Gowans, very good book. It was published by Baraka Books, which is a Canadian publishing house. Lots of very good information. Very good information. So yeah. All right. Why is the popular left so vengeful? This was a theme of my Kamala Harris book. The theme of it was very much that leftist politics, when stripped of ideology, simply becomes the releasing of impulses. It gives people the permission to unleash their impulses, and that can be their impulse toward aggression, their impulse toward sexuality. I missed a super chat. What super chat did I miss? Okay, we're going back up. What super chat did I miss? I don't think I missed a super chat. What did I miss here? Smaller social media apps like Snapchat can be considered part of lower level capital. I don't think so, generally. I mean, I don't think so. But yeah, you know, leftism stripped of economics and stripped of ideology just kind of becomes a movement about releasing impulses and creating greater instability in society as a result. And that's kind of a theme of my Kamala Harris book. People have anger, people have aggression, and rightly so. There's plenty to be angry about in the world. And a lot of the call-out culture, a lot of the cancel culture has just kind of turned into, you know, people being given permission by society to unload their anger and their resentment. And socialism isn't just about tearing things down, it's about building. It's about constructing. And that's a big theme of my Kamala Harris book. If you have questions about that, read my book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America. Get a copy of it. It's widely praised because this is a central theme of the book. All right. When will the GOP stop screaming socialism? Well, like I said, at some point, the lower levels of capital are going to have to come to terms with the fact that, that socialism is not their enemy. In fact, the only hope the middle class ultimately has for survival is with socialism. Right? It's the capitalists that are destroying the middle class, not the workers, right? Not the socialist movement, right? The socialist movement is allowing the middle class to flourish. Those lower level capitalists, you know, in a socialist society, they would be allowed to flourish as part of an overall state central plan in which the workers had the power. Whereas if Amazon and Bezos and Walmart have their way, they'll be crushed and they'll be absorbed by the corporate conglomerates. So at the end of the day, it's going to be a long process, but those lower levels of capital are going to have to come to terms with the fact that their future lies with the proletariat, and they're going to have to enter a class collaborationist united front against the imperialists. All right. Incel crisis. Isn't incel kind of an outdated thing? I thought that was like a thing like 2 or 3 years ago, but it's kind of like, you know, I mean, I don't know. I don't run in those circles. But look, I've said for a long time that the incel thing, it is a unique problem of social media, right? For years, there have been men who are resentful of women, who feel like women don't like them, feel oppressed because women don't want to sleep with them, etc. That's nothing new, right? You ever watch the musical Oklahoma? There's a character in Oklahoma, Judd Fry, right? They sing this song, "Poor Judd is dead, poor Judd Fry is dead." Judd Fry is an incel, right? The Phantom of the Opera, he's an incel. What is the Phantom of the Opera? He's an incel. He's ugly, right? And he has to wear the mask, and he's mad that the woman won't sleep with him, so he blows up the opera and all that. He's an incel. Phantom of the Opera is an incel. Judd Fry in the musical Oklahoma is an incel. There's nothing new about this phenomenon. What's new about it is that it used to be these people just kind of suffered alone and eventually made friends and kind of moved on or adjusted or something. What's new is that now these people get on the internet and they find a bunch of other young men who feel the way they feel. And instead of moving on and adjusting, they talk to other young men who feel this way, and they feed on each other's frustration, and they feed on each other until it turns into, they develop a whole ideology and a whole worldview centered around this feeling of resentment against women for not sleeping with them. And it's a very uniquely 21st century problem. And that at the end of the day, these guys, they feel like they feel like the field of romance is rigged against them for whatever reason. And they've developed a very depressive, hopeless, resentful, misogynist, hateful worldview centered around it. That's a big problem, and some of them have become mass shooters and killers. It's a problem. Look, it's a problem. My hope is that through maybe some counseling, things can change through maybe, my hope is that it can change. I don't think it's a crisis. I think it kind of peaked. I think it was a thing about 2 or 3 years ago, and it kind of decreased. It's not a thing anymore, right? I think we now have other problems in terms of politics, but it was just part of the internet culture, right? But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. But I feel like that is, I'm not hearing as much about it. When you super chatted me the question, that was like, I haven't heard about that kind of stuff for a while, which makes me think it's not as big of a problem anymore. Maybe I'm wrong. Look, at the end of the day, well, I don't know. I think I've said everything I need to say about it. I actually made the joke that I felt like the communist movement in the United States needs to stop being like incels, because a lot of these third worldists operate on the assumption no one will ever be interested in socialism. Oh, it's all hopeless. They're all Euros. And it's like when people, there's a name for this. They call this catastrophizing. Dr. Seuss, right? It's when you take something that's bad, okay? Like this guy can't find a girlfriend. That's bad, obviously. But he takes it and he blows it up into, I'll never be able to have a girlfriend. And this is because society is rigged against men, and this whole, and he's taking a real problem and he's blowing it up into a bigger problem and into a bigger problem and into a bigger problem until he's out of touch with reality. And people do this in all kinds of fields of life, Trust me. I've known people who are like this. They take a real problem and they turn it into something it's not. And then they turn that into something it's not. And then they turn that, and pretty soon they're out of touch with reality. And people that are paranoid, people that are worried, people that can be a little bit antisocial and resentful of society, they often will do that, okay? And I've often said there's parallels between internet communists and incels, because a lot of these internet communists, look, today I said that human growth is possible, and I had a bunch of people cursing me out. Nothing makes these people more angry than saying there's hope for the future. Why? Because these people, their internet communist identity is they sit on the internet cussing out the world and being angry, and there's no hope for a real socialist revolution. There's no hope for actually getting to a new socialist society, so they can just sit on the internet cussing and being angry. So when I walk in and I say, well, actually, you could join the Center for Political Innovation, we could get out of the movement and get to the masses, there's actually hope, they go, stop it, and I'm ruining they have this catastrophized worldview that justifies them being isolated and resentful, right? And it's a lot like the incels, right? If you want to make an incel mad, which I have, you really want to make an incel mad, tell them, hey, I think you could get a girlfriend. I think you've given up too easily. I think you could get a girlfriend. If you did this and that, I think they will blow up with you at so much rage because they have developed this catastrophized worldview, that, my whole identity is centered around the fact that women are and that's the thing. When people develop these really complex worldviews that justify being alone and isolated, when they do that, that it's not about reality. It's about protecting themselves, right? It's about protecting themselves, right? These incels, they've been hurt, obviously. They have a lingering pain, so they're trying to protect themselves from the pain of going out and taking that risk again and getting their heart broken again, basically, right? Just like a lot of socialists. Look, they've been so frustrated with Americans not being open to socialist ideas and being reactionary and all of that, so they rather than take the risk of going out and trying to spread socialism in America, it just can't be done, and they're protecting themselves, okay? And that's what a lot of this stuff is about, right? It's that the world, they've been frustrated, they've been hurt, and they're suffering, and they don't want to go out and take the risk again. So they come up with a worldview that says, well, it's okay to remain passive. It's okay, and that, I urge people to get out of that. Thank you, Proletarian Guard. I urge people to get beyond that. I urge people to keep trying. Don't surrender. Do not surrender. Folks, there is toxic pessimism coming out of your cell phone every day. Every day there is toxic pessimism coming out of your cell phone, coming out of your television, coming out of your social media. Every day, coming out of your computer, your laptop. We are bombarded with the toxic pessimism. I talk about that higher level of capital, that ultra rich. The way that they have gained the upper hand is that Silicon Valley, social media is their turf. And there is toxic pessimism coming out of social media every day. The worldview of the ultra rich, that toxic, there is no hope, the world is coming to an end, human beings are a cancer, blah, blah, blah. That is coming out of your cell phone every day. Silicon Valley has fucked your mind. Excuse my French there. Silicon Valley has pumped pessimism into you constantly. And the social media revolution, right, has given them so much of the upper hand to pump their toxic pessimism into you. And everybody I know is fighting a daily battle against this poison that is just pumped at us. The doomerism, as Dan B is calling it. It is just pumped into us every day. This toxic poison is pumped into us. And it's like a daily battle. It is a daily battle to get up. It is a daily battle to go out into the world and keep trying. It is a fight, right? Well, I'm here to tell you, keep fighting. Keep fighting. Don't surrender. Don't surrender to the capitalists. Don't surrender to the ultra-rich and their pessimism. Keep fighting back. Keep fighting back. Not only can you succeed in this life, not only can you achieve your dreams and go out and achieve things, but we're going to save humanity from this nightmare. We're going to overthrow the capitalist system and build a society where the banks, factories, and industries operate according to public good and growth is unlimited. Keep fighting. Do not surrender. Fight back. Keep fighting. You will survive. There is hope. There is no limit to human growth and creativity. There is only a limit to the irrational greed of the insane capitalists and billionaire monopolists that rule this world. So keep fighting, don't surrender, and don't let the toxic poison that comes out of your phone, control you. Don't surrender. Do not surrender in the face of the toxic pessimism that is pumped into you by this society. Don't commit suicide. Don't become a heroin addict, right? Don't become a porn addict, right? Don't lose your mind. Don't destroy yourself. Fight back. I'm urging you to keep fighting. You are fighting for the entire human race. It is people like you and your ability to resist the poison coming out of your cell phone, the poison coming out of your laptop and your TV. It is your ability to fight against that. It is your ability to do that that is the hope for the future. And one good thing I will say is that as much as your cell phone and your TV and your computer are rigged to pump you with this pessimism, you have a choice, right? I wake up every day and I go to sleep every day with Beethoven, Bach, or Mozart. Progressive, optimistic, scientific music. Okay? Every day, right? I'm sure Silicon Valley would love that I listen to Miley Cyrus, or I don't even know. Is she even still a thing? I don't know. They would love I listen to, I don't know. But instead, every day, I wake up in the morning with Mozart, Bach, and Beethoven. I go to sleep with Mozart, Bach, and Beethoven. No, Mozart, Bach, and Beethoven were not monarchists. Beethoven was a revolutionary, my friend. Beethoven, you should look into Beethoven's life. He cussed out. He said, there will be many princes, but there will be only one Beethoven. His symphony, the Eroica, was dedicated to Napoleon until Napoleon declared himself emperor, and then he crossed it out of the score in rage, and he hated Napoleon because he didn't want emperors. He believed in an elected government. He dedicated his Sixth Symphony. Ludwig von Beethoven dedicated his Sixth Symphony to the peasantry when they were fighting. Kinky's talking about Brahms. Brahms went out, the Brahms lullaby. He went out and found folk songs, the music of the people, and he turned them into symphonies. He found the music of the people, the music that people composed, the folk songs, and he combined them and made them into gigantic symphonic pieces. These were revolutionaries. Classical music is deeply revolutionary. It's deeply revolutionary, and it appeals to the scientific and the intellectual side of human beings. And that's what makes it very, very powerful. China is social imperialist, all right? Social imperialist. All right. Right? And that must be understood. But anyway, enough about that. Okay. Ecuador. Well, look, the people of Ecuador are tired of neoliberalism. They're tired of Lenin Moreno, the traitor, who claimed he was a socialist and then got in there and started cooperating, who gave up Assange, and people are tired of it, and they want socialism back. The pandemic has emphasized to Ecuador and to the people there how much they really need to have a socialist society. I have a friend who was living there the day Moreno got in. Practically, they could see the economic impact. Rafael Correa, wasn't good on abortion. Not a supporter of gay marriage, socially conservative, but he was definitely a socialist. I went there to Ecuador. I got to tell you, 2013, I went to Ecuador. I remember every morning, the young socialist revolutionary kids that are part of the youth revolutionary group that Correa set up, the Bolivarian youth, they gather in the parks and they do karate. And it's not karate, it's a special martial art that Correa invented. It's beautiful. All these kids, thousands of kids from working class neighborhoods, from poor families, all wearing their uniforms and doing karate in the morning and learning to self-defense. Wow, I saw it. They have, it's something else. In the middle of very impoverished neighborhoods in Ecuador, they have these tents where anyone can just get in line and get their teeth cleaned by a dentist, right? And it's usually a Cuban dentist, right? It's you wouldn't believe what the, Rafael Correa is widely loved in Ecuador for his reforms. And Lenin Moreno pretended that he was an ally of Correa, got in and started dismantling that. Well, now the people of Ecuador are ready to go back to socialism. Period. End of discussion. All right. Do revolutionary movements require a central figure? Well, that's a good question. I don't think so. And actually, one thing that I noticed in Venezuela is that, you had Maduro, who's the leader of the country, but a lot of the colectivos and a lot of the communes had their own central figure. I went to one commune in central Caracas, and it was centered around a priest who was a revolutionary Christian priest. I went to another colectivo that was, run by allies of the Communist Party of Venezuela, and it was centered around a very charismatic individual. And that, in the old, Soviet-style Cold War model, you have the entire state economy, the entire economy being owned by the state, thank you, Herb Bryant, and you have one charismatic leader at the center of it. What really existing socialism in our time seems to be different is that you do have a state and you do have, central planning, but you have a lot of independent worker cooperatives, and you have a lot of different private companies, and for example, Huawei Technologies. The founder of Huawei Technologies is a very charismatic leader who has his own beliefs and his own ideology. He's not a rival of President Xi Jinping, but he's a figure, and that modern socialism is a little bit more ideologically diverse. In the Bolivarian government of Venezuela, you've got Maoists, you've got Trotskyists, you've got hardline socialists. They've got different parties, the whole patriotic pole, and so it's complicated. Cuba, right? Cuba, marketizations. It's complicated, right? So, and that one thing about really existing socialism is that you tend to have more charismatic figures and more poles within society and more institutions. It's not all centered around the government, right? You have different institutions that are centralized, centered around the state, but you have more independent institutions kind of functioning as part of it. The 21st century socialism, instead of it being a solo, where the whole state is one instrument. It's more like an orchestra, where you have a conductor. The state is at the center directing it, but you have a whole orchestra, playing and making beautiful music together. And that's more sustainable long term, right? The problems in the Soviet Union. Look what happened when Stalin died and Khrushchev got in there. Does this apply to pre-revolutionary movements? I don't know. I don't know. I really don't know. All righty, we're getting through this. All right, the Battle of Seattle. Good question. How old was I? I was 12 years old. See, totally a real painting back there. I was 12 years old when the Battle of Seattle happened. The Battle of Seattle. And I had no idea. I looked at I was probably younger than that, actually. I remember I saw Newsweek or a magazine that my grandmother had, and there was somebody with a mask over their face, and they were breaking a window, and it said anti-capitalist anarchist protester, and I was like, they're against capitalism? Are they a communist? I had no idea what that was. I mean, it was a pivotal moment, right? It was a huge upsurge against neoliberalism. The labor unions marched, and the anarchists broke some stuff, and it was big. It was, when the World Trade Organization met in Seattle, there were big protests against it. And I think the George Soros kind of, the crowd, that was kind of starting to question some of the environmental policies, they were there. The trade union folks were there, and it was kind of a left-wing, anti-corporate kind of event in 1999. It was against neoliberalism, basically. And you'll remember that the American public had no idea what it was about. And I remember these trade protests would happen, and Americans would have no idea what it was about. Does modern socialism need another event to realize liberals aren't fighting the same like socialists did in 1848? No, I mean, that's not how these things work. I'll talk about that. All right. Okay. Smashing the state machinery. Well, look, I have always made clear that what socialists advocate is a peaceful transition to socialism. We advocate a popular front government, a coalition government of progressive forces that are against war and empire getting elected, and standing up against the big monopolies. And such a government, out of necessity, would be forced to change how the military works. They'd be forced to change how the economy works and nationalize industries. They would be forced to change things. And that in order for a popular front, anti-monopoly government to take power, they would be forced to dismantle the imperialist state. And they would have to do it with a democratic popular mandate. But any working class, anti-monopoly, anti-war government that took power in the United States would be forced to dismantle the state. They would be forced to change the way the police and the military work, the way the intelligence agencies work. They would be forced to move toward a socialist society and dismantle the capitalist state. They would be forced to transition to socialism, even if they didn't want that, even if they were just elected on the platform of, hey, no more war, jobs for all. If they got into office, the capitalists would fight them so hard, the only way they'd be able to stay in power would be to change the nature of the state. And that would be all they could do. That would be all they could do to change the nature of the state. So, and that has long been the position. Communists are not advocates of violent revolution. They are not advocates of left adventurism and terrorism. Communists advocate a peaceful transition towards socialism. And the only situation in which a communist would be involved, and the only situation in which communists have been involved in violent revolution, is when that is forced on them by the capitalists, when they have no choice. So there you go. I see, Tyler. I wrote your other question down. All right. Okay. Eliminate poverty without capitalism, finite growth. Well, look, the way humans interact with resources changes, okay? Humans change the way they interact with resources, okay? And our ability to acquire resources from asteroids, from other planets, is going to expand. Look, China's already getting helium-3 from the moon. There's talk of extracting, some resources from Mars. And look, there are minerals in Africa that just 20, 30 years ago were completely worthless, that are now very valuable because they're used in computer chips. So yes, obviously, material is not going to magically appear out of the universe, okay? But I do believe that human beings have the ability to constantly change, to constantly innovate, and to constantly adjust and interact with their environment in new ways, okay? And that's why I don't accept the eco-pessimist argument. All right. The way we're interacting with our environment right now is not sustainable. I'll give you that. Fossil fuels is not sustainable. Climate change, look at what's happening. I'm with you, okay? I'm not a climate denier. Super hurricanes, it's happening, okay? No one can deny that there is definitely climate change, and it's definitely impacted by human behavior. No question about it. However, we need to change the way we interact with our environment. And we need to operate with our environment in a sustainable way. And that means advancing, being more rational. It doesn't mean ending human growth and progress. All right. China's recent jailing of activists. I don't know about the recent one, but many times I have read articles in the New York Times and in media, Marxist activists jailed in China. And it's like, well, I mean, why were they jailed? I mean, is it possible that they were jailed unjustly? Sure. Is it possible they were not jailed unjustly? Folks, what if there was a headline in China, capitalist jailed in the United States, right? The prisons of the United States are full of people who believe in capitalism. That shows the American government is so hypocritical. I bet you the majority of people in our prisons right now, if you ask them what they believe in capitalism. Does that prove that they were unjustly arrested? No, right? Is it possible that the Chinese government is suppressing activists wrongfully? Sure, right? During the Cultural Revolution, a lot of very good activists, and Marxists were suppressed wrongly, including Deng Xiaoping, right? Including Madame Sun Yat-sen, right? Is it possible this is happening again? Sure. But just that headline, Marxist activist, that doesn't prove anything. Look, Stalin killed Trotsky, right? So you want to talk about suppressing a Marxist revolutionary? Trotsky was a leader of the Russian Revolution. Stalin killed him, right? I mean, these things happen, okay? Sometimes they're bad, sometimes they're not. They're necessary, but, you don't know. Right? Is it possible that these activists in China were doing the right thing and they're being unfairly suppressed by China? Sure. Is it possible that they were arrested in China because they're, trying to destabilize the Chinese government and being dupes of American imperialism? Sure. Do I know that that's what's happening? No. Do I know that what's happening to them is bad? No. I don't know what's going on, and neither do you. And you can't trust American media to tell you about it. That's for sure. That's for sure. You can't trust American media. So I always take stories like that with a little grain of salt, right? But very good revolutionary activists have been suppressed in China throughout China's history. Great revolutionary activists were suppressed in the Soviet Union. Nobody denies there were a lot of very, very good people who ended up in gulags during the Great Terror or Yezhovshchina of 1937. No matter what your position is on Stalin, nobody denies that a lot of innocent people went to gulags and got suppressed by Stalin, during that time. Now people blame it on Yezhov. So I will never deny that bad things have happened in the socialist movement, that good people have suffered. I will never deny that, ever. But I just don't know what's happening in this individual case. Neither do you, right? We do know, and this is something we do know. Again, we don't know if this is related to this or not, but the CIA has something called the International Federation of Free Trade Unions. I believe it's called that. It's a CIA-controlled labor union federation. And often, when we read stories in the New York Times about the suppression of labor unions in China, what they're not telling you is it's not just random labor unions. They're these CIA-affiliated unions. Jay Lovestone, the renegade sellout leader of the Communist Party, ended up becoming the leader of the CIA's trade union manipulation. And Solidarność in Poland, an anti-Semitic union that was preaching vicious hatred for Jews and had admirers of Hitler in it and helped destabilize and overthrow the socialist government of Poland, that was set up by the CIA. Were they a union? Yep. Did U.S. media say they were fighting for their rights? Yep. Were they good? Nope. Did they help Poland? Nope. I mean, so it's more complicated than that. It's more complicated than that. Read all about Jay Lovestone and the CIA's trade union work, right? The CIA has all kinds of trade union fronts. So just because someone is a trade unionist or just because someone's labeled a labor activist or a Marxist or a socialist doesn't mean they're necessarily good. Doesn't mean they're bad. They could be good. But generally, U.S. media tends to not highlight the suppression of good people. And tends to try and, we know the color revolution thing. So I'm suspicious of anything that's being highlighted in American media about that. But that doesn't mean they're not wrong, right? I mean, that doesn't mean, I don't know about the case. I'm just telling you, you have to see it through this lens. You have to understand that the U.S. imperialist media does not want to advance the struggle of the working class against socialism, or against imperialism, okay? U.S. media is not our friend, is not our ally. CNN is not our friend. There will never be a socialism that CNN will approve of, okay? All right, Dr. Seuss. It's funny. Dr. Seuss is an interesting, right? The Lorax, and the 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins. And what's interesting is Dr. Seuss, I've known about this for years. Dr. Seuss was a friend of the Communist Party USA, never joined, but he was an ally of the Communist Party. He was friendly with them. He lived in, I believe he was from New York City, and he was friendly with the Communist Party, and he was a supporter of Republican Spain, and in fact, he wrote a book called Horton Hears a Who that was actually dedicated to the fight of the Spanish people and the Spanish Republic against fascism. And he was sympathetic to Marxism and socialism. He made some cartoons that are offensive, and there's no denying that. It's indefensible. You look at some of these early cartoons he made, racial caricatures of Asian people, of black people, not okay. I would never defend that. If you're looking for me to defend that, so you can say, aha, Caleb's a racist, he defended. No, I didn't. No, I didn't. So don't, whatever. No. Not going to defend that. And also, I don't like the Lorax book, honestly. I think that the Lorax book, while obviously environmentalism is a concern, the message of the Lorax book is it's kind of this belief that growth is bad. That the problem isn't the way you interact with your environment. The problem is that growth is bad. And I don't agree with the Lorax book. So I have criticism. I think that Dr. Seuss is overall a progressive figure. He wrote a book opposing the arms race, which was beautiful. To have a children's book opposing the nuclear arms race, that's amazing. That's great. The fact that he wrote a book for Republican Spain and their struggle against fascism, that's great. There's anti-racist themes in a lot of his books. That's good. So you take the good and the bad. That's the way the world is. There's nothing in this universe, for the most part, nothing under the sun that is all good or all bad. I think Dr. Seuss was a largely progressive figure who, made some mistakes. That's it. Period. End of discussion. All right. Okay. The argument that China is social imperialist. If you understand what imperialism actually means, okay, you won't think China's imperialist. If you think imperialism is a country trading with another country, well, then you might think China's imperialist. If you think imperialism is a country being militarily involved in another country, then you might think China's imperialist. If you think that imperialism is a country making money through trade with another country, you might think China's imperialist. China's not imperialist because imperialism is a specific relationship. Imperialism is when a country makes another country poor, right? Imperialism is, when the British go to India and they burn down all the textile mills, force them to import their cloth from Britain. That's imperialism. Imperialism is, the United States overthrows the Iraqi government and blows to bits a country that had a strong, centrally planned economy where oil was exported in competition with them, and Iraq is reduced to chaos and rubble. Imperialism is when Libya is blown to bits and the country with the highest life expectancy on the African continent is reduced to chaos and rubble. Imperialism is, when Guatemala has had a string of governments that are puppets of American corporations, and as a result, there are people in the country that are not literate, that don't even speak Spanish. Lots of people don't have running water and electricity. The drug gangs are everywhere. People are fleeing. Imperialism is about holding back economic development, keeping the world poor so that Wall Street and London can stay rich. That's what imperialism is. What China is doing around the world, building power plants, building hospitals, building schools, building railways, setting up shop, letting Chinese businesses do business in countries. That's not imperialism, right? If the country's getting richer and China's getting richer at the same time, that's not imperialism. Imperialism is one country gaining at the expense of another country, right? If both countries are rising, that's not imperialism. Imperialism refers to an economic relationship, a specific economic relationship. Imperialism is capitalism in its monopoly stage. So these people who say China is imperialist, they don't understand what imperialism actually means. That's okay. They have a vague liberal understanding of imperialism, which they, for some reason, don't apply very much to the Western United States, but they apply to China with extreme scrutiny, right? But if you understand the scientific Marxist definition of imperialism, you'll understand China's not imperialist. All right, Cuba's marketizations. I think it's good that Cuba is having market, reforms. They need to improve, they've had some difficulties in the country because of the sanctions imposed on the United States and all of that, and because of the problems Venezuela has had. Venezuela was sending them lots of oil, and Venezuela's been having problems. So Cuba needs to adjust its economy somewhat. My hope is that they do it in a way that strengthens socialism and makes the socialist society there stronger and all that. But, I think that having some market reforms is not a bad thing in Cuba. It's necessary to some degree, right? And they would like to do more of it. They're restricted by the horrendous blockade the imperialists have set up. All right. Do we need some event? Well, look, the way things work, generally, sometimes there are events that can be pivotal, but rarely is there like an event that happens that just changes everything and dramatically makes the consciousness change overnight. They talk about quality into quantity, and often it's very little changes that add up into one big change, right? That you're talking about the 1848 revolution, we need a moment to realize the liberals, blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm telling you that rarely is there just one event that changes things. Look, this Texas situation, right? It's obvious to me what the problem is. The problem is the American government doesn't invest in the country anymore. We're not building good power plants and facilities. We're not building infrastructure. The country's crumbling, right? And we need a government of action to fight for working families. Common sense to me. But what do we hear in American media about the Texas crisis? Well, the conservatives say the problem is green energy. Well, okay, some of the windmills froze because they weren't prepared for the freezing conditions. They built them on the cheap. That's not good, okay? So, the conservatives just say, oh, see, the problem is climate change. Well, no, the problem isn't climate change, okay? There's a problem of lack of investment in infrastructure. Liberals say, oh, see, the problem is all caused by the fact there's too much consumption and it's a climate change problem. That's like, no, the problem is the American government is not investing in the infrastructure of the country. Seems like common sense to me, and if all it took was an event, you'd think that would wake people up. Oh, wow, maybe instead of bombing countries all over the world, we ought to build some goddamn power plants that don't, break in the wintertime. You would think that would be the answer. But when the means of information, when we have synthetic left versus libertarian right, the conversation becomes green energy is bad, or this is all caused by global warming and humans are consuming too much. And we have this stupid look. The greatest threat to America's working families is libertarianism, the belief that government has no role in the economy, privatize everything, and synthetic leftism, the unleashing of destructive impulses and pessimism and anti-humanism. Those are the two cancers that ideologically affect the United States. And they're two sides of the same coin, really, right? It's neoliberalism in economics and neoliberalism in philosophy and ideology. That's basically what they are. They're a cancer, right? And until we overcome those, things are not going to get better. Sources for Dubček's CIA far-right connections. Oh, sure. Radio Free Europe, which was the American propaganda broadcasts into Czechoslovakia, were blatantly supporting Dubček. And actually, Gus Hall talks about, in one of his pamphlets on Czechoslovakia, the fact that members of Young Americans for Freedom, the right-wing organization, were flying into Czechoslovakia to be involved in the protests. I actually heard a wild story about Czechoslovakia that I'll just end with this, right? I think we'll end here, but it's an important story. So, Prague Spring, 1968, you had these protests against the government of Czechoslovakia, anti-Soviet, etc. So, obviously the Soviet Union sends in troops to put it down, and so American media goes crazy about the evil Soviets sending in the tanks, blah, 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 right? So, there was a group of Trotskyites in New York City. I don't want to say the group because I don't want to get it wrong, but there's a Trotskyite group in New York City that hates the Soviet Union, is always talking about we need a workers' revolt against the evil Stalinist regime, blah, blah, blah. So after that, they make a point of flying in to New York City leaders of the government, of the uprising in Czechoslovakia. Some leaders of this Czechoslovak uprising against Dubček. They flew them in. I heard this story several times from people who were in the room. Flew them in. These Czechoslovakian, leaders of the Prague Spring are flown in. And all these Trotskyites, people that protest the Vietnam War, civil rights marches, are all sitting there in this big auditorium. They want to listen to these anti-Stalinist, socialism with a human face organizers from Czechoslovakia. And these organizers from Czechoslovakia get on the microphone and start talking about how there's an evil Jewish conspiracy that controls the world, and how communism is a Jewish conspiracy against the white man, and how Hitler was right in World War II, and they were Nazis. And this room full of Trotskyites went, They had flown a bunch of they assumed, just because they were fighting against the government of Czechoslovakia, just because they were anti-Russian, they assumed that they must be good people. And these people they flew in were a bunch of Nazis, okay? They were a bunch of Nazis. So they flew a bunch of Nazis in, right? And so then, you gotta love this. So then, one of the Trotskyite leaders, finally they just took the microphone away from them because they were just spewing all kinds of anti-Semitism and pro-Nazi rhetoric. They finally took the microphone away from them. And the audience is like in shock, right? So then the leader of the Trotskyite group got on the microphone. He's like, we can forgive them. We can forgive them for their views because you got to understand, they're up against the Stalinists. They're up against the Stalinists. When people are up against the Stalinists, they start believing bad things. This is the Stalinists' fault that these people are like this. Imagine if you'd grown up under Stalinism, you might become a Nazi too. That was their argument. The Trotskyites are sitting there going, oh shit, you got a bunch of Nazis we just flown in. And but somehow the fact that these people were backed by the CIA and they're Nazi, it's the Soviet Union's fault. It's all the Soviet Union's fault. That was their argument, right? And that's classic. That is Trotskyism in essence, right? They flew in people assuming they must be good because they're against the Soviet Union. They were Nazis. And then somehow that's all Stalin's fault. That is the essence of synthetic leftism and Trotskyism and all of that. So I've heard that anecdote repeated many times. It happened in New York City in I think it was the early 70s that that it happened. And it's probably not the first time that something like that has happened. So I just wanted to share that little anecdote. But anyway, on that note, folks, I do want to end. I want to thank you all for being here. You all are deeply special to me. It's always a pleasure to interact with you. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night.